The kelp tells you what the water did before you got there. That's what Marguerite Solano's mother used to say, standing waist deep in the cold shallows before a dive, looking at the canopy the way other people read the morning paper. She said kelp didn't lie and didn't forget. A bed that was thriving told you the water had been kind for a
These
long
journals
stretch.
document the shoreline changes
A bed
we've
that was
tracked for
struggling
years.
told you
I
something
see.
had happened.
And the data is consistent?
Even if you hadn't been there to see it happen yourself. Marguerite was 65 years old. She had been reading kelp her entire adult life. She'd learned the trade from her mother, who'd started the family's small commercial kelp harvesting operation in the early 1970s, teaching herself the practical economics of it while learning the water itself from a handful of old-timers along the stretch of the Northern California coast, men and women who themselves had learned from people whose names existed now only as a kind of local folklore, half-remembered, half-invented. The way knowledge sometimes survives by becoming story once it stops being passed down directly from one careful observer to the next. Marguerite's mother had taken what those old-timers showed her and turned it into something closer to a discipline. She freedove the same half-mile of coastline 3 or 4 times a week for 50 years. And she wrote down what she saw every single time. The journals were the most valuable thing Marguerite owned, though she'd never once thought of them in terms of monetary value. 5 decades of her mother's observations. Canopy density, water clarity, specific notes about particular microhabitats within the bed, the kind of granular attention that only comes from loving something enough to keep checking on it, season after season, long after the checking stopped feeling like work and started feeling like something closer to a conversation. Marguerite had continued to practice herself for 30 years, her own volumes now sitting on the same shelf as her mother's, who had passed 6 years ago, peacefully at home, with one of the journals still open on her nightstand, the final entry unfinished mid-sentence in a way that had taken Marguerite nearly a year to be able to look at without crying. Marguerite still dove that half-mile of coast 3 or 4 times a week, the way her mother had, the way the old-timers presumably had before either of them. The trouble started in a section of the bed Marguerite had always thought of as the healthiest part, a dense, sheltered stretch near a stormwater outfall pipe that emptied onto the bluff above. The outfall had been there for decades, an unremarkable piece of municipal infrastructure that drained runoff from the older part of town above the coastline. The kelp near it had always grown thick and resilient, better even in some of the more exposed sections of the bed. 3 years ago, Marguerite noticed a first thinning. It happened in a pattern she didn't immediately recognize as a pattern. The bed near the outfall would die back, not catastrophically, just noticeably, in the weeks following the season's first heavy autumn rains. Then, through winter and into spring, it would partially recover. Then the following autumn, the same thing would happen again, the dieback a little more pronounced than the year before, the recovery a little less complete. She wrote it down each time. Canopy density at the outfall section, percentage decline, timing relative to the season's rainfall. She didn't have an explanation. She had a worry and a pattern of numbers that kept getting slightly worse, and a section of bed she'd been diving since childhood, that her mother had dived before her, that had never once in 50 combined years of records shown anything like this slow erosion of resilience. She pulled her mother's journals and looked for anything similar in 50 years of records. There were storm seasons documented throughout, some severe, some mild, but nothing that matched the specific rhythm of dieback after rain, partial recovery, dieback again, each cycle a little weaker than the last. This was new. She didn't know why. Around the same time the third autumn dieback occurred, the county announced plans to replace the aging stormwater outfall system along that section of bluff with a larger capacity pipe. New hillside development further up the watershed had increased runoff volume beyond what the old infrastructure could reliably handle during heavy storms, and the county's engineering department had secured state infrastructure funding to upgrade the system before it failed entirely and caused flooding problems to the development above. Marguerite read about the project in the local paper and felt something tighten in her chest that she couldn't fully name. She didn't know if the existing outfall had anything to do with what she was seeing in the kelp. But the timing of the dieback, always following the season's first heavy rains, always concentrated nearest the outfall, made her uneasy enough that she requested to speak at the project's environmental review hearing. The hearing was held in a county building with a particular institutional blandness of rooms designed for exactly this purpose. Marguerite brought 3 of her mother's journals and 2 of her own, marked with notes pointing to the relevant entries. She described the 3-year dieback pattern as clearly as she could: the timing, the partial recoveries, the progressive weakening. She explained that she couldn't say for certain the existing outfall was responsible, only that the kelp's recent behavior near was unlike anything documented in 50 years of her family's records, and that she was concerned a larger discharge pipe might make whatever was happening worse rather than better. The county's project engineer, a thorough and not unkind man named Reyes, explained that the outfall replacement was simply a capacity upgrade, a bigger pipe handling the same kind of stormwater discharge that had always gone to that location, with no new chemical inputs and no change to the discharge's basic composition. The environmental review's water quality testing had found nothing concerning in the existing discharge, and the upgrade wasn't expected to introduce anything new. "We're not changing what's in the water," Reyes said, "just how much of it can move through at once." Marguerite didn't have a counterargument ready for that distinction. She wasn't a hydrologist. She knew kelp, and kelp had been telling her something for 3 years that she couldn't yet translate into the kind of language a county engineer's review would need to take seriously. She thanked him and sat down, aware of the gap between what she knew and what she could prove, the particular frustration of having decades of careful observation that nonetheless didn't translate into the kind of evidence a formal review process was built to weigh. She wasn't angry at Reyes. He had answered the question that had actually been asked. She just wasn't sure she'd known how to ask the right one yet. She kept diving. She kept writing. That winter, after the hearing, she found herself rereading her mother's journals more carefully than she had in years, not looking for a single matching entry this time, but reading slowly, the way you reread a letter from someone you miss, looking for the texture of how her mother had thought about the water rather than just the data points themselves. Her mother had written more than once across the decades about timing, not just whether a storm was severe, but how the fresh water entered the system, whether it came in a single hard pulse or spread itself across several tide cycles. Marguerite had noticed this detail before, without quite registering its significance. Her mother seemed to believe, based on nothing more than decades of careful watching, that the kelp tolerated runoff differently depending on how it arrived, not just how much of it there was. One entry from 1989 read, "Storm dump hard, all at once. This week, outfall ran heavy for maybe 6 hours. Kelp near it looked rough after, but bounced back fast. Faster than I expected given how much came through." A later entry, several years on, "Different storm this fall. Smaller total rainfall, but the ground was already soaked, so it all came off the hill slow, over 2 full days. Outfall barely seemed to slow down the whole time. Kelp near it took longer to recover than I'd have guessed from a storm this size." Her mother had noticed, decades earlier, that slow and sustained discharge seemed harder on the kelp than a single hard pulse, the opposite of what Marguerite would have assumed, and apparently the opposite of what her mother had expected too, given the slightly surprised tone of the original entry. She had written it down as a curiosity, never developed it further, never had reason to, because in her lifetime the old outfall had simply continued doing what it had always done, slow and steady, year after year, never once forcing the question. Marguerite sat with those 2 entries for a long time. She thought about how many other small observations like this were probably scattered through 50 years of pages, waiting for a question that hadn't existed yet when they were written. The old outfall, she realized, slow draining as it was, had always released its discharge gradually, across many hours, sometimes more than a day, spread thin across multiple tide cycles. The new, larger capacity pipe wouldn't do that. It would move the same total volume of water, but faster in a more concentrated pulse, simply because it had the capacity to. She didn't know if that was actually the mechanism behind the dieback she'd been watching. She wasn't a scientist. She had 2 of her mother's old journal entries and 3 years of her own careful notes, and a feeling that the pieces fit together in a way she couldn't fully prove on her own. She decided she needed someone who could test it properly. She reached out to a graduate researcher at a nearby marine sciences program, a young woman named Dr. Aiko Tanaka, who was studying nearshore kelp ecology and had given a public talk Marguerite had attended the previous spring. Marguerite described what she'd observed, sent photographs of the relevant journal pages, and asked if any of it made scientific sense. Dr. Tanaka came out to walk the bluff and look at the bed within the week. She spent an afternoon going through both sets of journals, Marguerite's 30 years, her mother's 50, cross-referencing the dieback timing against what little public rainfall and discharge data existed for the area. The county hadn't historically monitored discharge rate at the specific outfall in any granular way. Their record showed total monthly volume, not the timing or intensity of individual release events. This is the kind of data nobody collects, Dr. Tanaka said, looking at Marguerite's careful canopy measurements alongside her mother's older notes about discharge timing. Not because it isn't important, because nobody thought to ask the question your mother was already answering 40 years ago. She explained, in terms Marguerite could follow, what she suspected was happening. Kelp holdfast and the seasonal sediment tolerance of a bed like this one developed around a particular rhythm of freshwater exposure. A bed accustomed to slow, sustained low-volume discharge built its seasonal resilience around that rhythm. A sudden shift toward concentrated, high-volume pulses, even without any change in total seasonal volume or chemical composition, could exceed the bed's tolerance threshold in ways that wouldn't necessarily show up in standard water quality testing, which checked for specific contaminants rather than for physical stress of pulse intensity itself. It was a plausible mechanism. It wasn't proof. Marguerite asked if there was a way to test it before the new pipe went in, some way of confirming the theory before it became something they could only verify by watching it happen. Dr. Tanaka said the honest answer was no, not without discharge monitoring equipment the county had installed and had no plan to install, not on a timeline that would arrive before construction was already complete. "We'd need to see what happens with a new pipe to know for certain," she said, and Marguerite understood. Sitting with that sentence, that the only path forward ran directly through the thing she was afraid of. The new outfall was completed that summer, on schedule, exactly as the county had planned, exactly as Reyes had described at the hearing. A straightforward capacity upgrade with no new chemical inputs, functioning precisely as intended. The first major storm season after completion arrived in late autumn, heavier than the previous 3 years combined, a genuine atmospheric river event that delivered an enormous volume of rain to the watershed in a relatively short window. The new outfall did exactly what it was designed to do. It moved the water through quickly, efficiently, without the flooding risk the old undersized pipe would have created. The kelp bed near the outfall, already weakened by 3 consecutive years of incomplete recovery, did not partially recover this time. Within weeks of the storm, nearly the entire historically dense section had collapsed. Not thinned, not stressed, but gone. The holdfast torn loose. The canopy that sheltered a particular nearshore species estate had been quietly monitoring for population health, now simply absent. The water above it open and bare in a way Marguerite had never seen in 30 years of diving that exact spot. The collapse triggered a formal habitat assessment. The state's concern about the monitored species' habitat loss raised the real possibility of new harvest restrictions across the broader bed. The opposite outcome from what either the county or Marguerite had wanted, a consequence neither the engineering review nor Marguerite's own warnings had anticipated taking this particular form. Dr. Tanaka led the formal post-collapse investigation, this time with proper instrumentation in place. Flow sensors at the new outfall, water column monitoring stations positioned specifically to capture discharge pulse intensity rather than just monthly totals. The data, gathered over the following storm season, confirmed what she and Marguerite had suspected. The new outfall's discharge, even at the same total seasonal volume as the old system, arrived in concentrated pulses nearly 4 times more intense than the old slow drain configuration had ever produced. The kelp bed seasonal tolerance, built, it appeared, around decades of slower, gentler discharge, had no capacity to absorb that intensity. Dr. Tanaka's formal report, submitted to both the county and the State Habitat Assessment Board, included an appendix built almost entirely from the 2 journals, Marguerite's 30 years of canopy and dieback observations, and her mother's 50 years of broader coastal notes, including the 1989 and later entries comparing fast and slow discharge recovery, entries written decades before anyone had a reason to ask the question those entries were quietly answering. Neither of these records alone would have been enough, Dr. Tanaka told Marguerite, sitting at her kitchen table with both journals open between them. Your mother documented the mechanism without knowing it mattered. You documented the consequence without knowing the mechanism. It took someone putting the two next to each other to see the whole thing. Marguerite thought about her mother, free diving the same stretch of coast for 50 years, writing down small curiosities she never developed further because nothing in her lifetime had asked her to. She thought about the old-timers who taught her mother, whose name survived now mostly as rumor, who had presumably noticed things too and never written any of it down at all, whose knowledge had simply ended with them, the way most knowledge eventually does. Unless someone happens to be the kind of person who keeps a notebook for no reason except that it feels important to remember. She asked Dr. Tanaka, somewhat abruptly, whether the report would include her mother's name. Dr. Tanaka said of course. The journal entries were primary source material, and her mother would be cited exactly the way any researcher would be cited, with full attribution, in a federal habitat assessment that would likely outlive both of them. The remediation took nearly 2 years. The county, working with Dr. Tanaka's team and a coastal engineering firm, retrofitted the new outfall with a controlled release mechanism, a system that maintained the larger pipe's flood prevention capacity during genuine emergency conditions, but otherwise metered discharge back into something closer to the old system's slower, gentler rhythm during routine storm events, essentially teaching the new infrastructure to behave like the old infrastructure had behaved, just with more capacity, held in reserve for the rare moments that actually demanded it. It cost considerably more than the original upgrade. It took political what the county hadn't initially planned to spend, and a public hearing process that, this time, opened with Marguerite's journals already part of the official record rather than something she had to introduce from the audience. In the kelp bed itself, recovery moved at the pace recovery always moved in a system like this, not quickly, not in a single dramatic season, but steadily, year over year, as new growth established and the bed structure slowly rebuilt itself near the retrofitted outfall. The first season after the retrofit showed barely measurable change. The second season showed something Marguerite could finally call progress without qualifying it. By the third, the recovery had become unmistakable even to someone who hadn't been watching as closely as she had. Marguerite kept diving. She kept writing. 3 years after the retrofit, the bed near the outfall had recovered to roughly 2/3 of its historical density. Not fully restored, but trending in the right direction. The dieback and incomplete recovery cycle finally broken. The hold fast taking again in the same patient way they always had before anything had gone wrong. She sat at her kitchen table one evening that winter with both sets of journals open in front of her, her mother's 50 years, her own 30+, the handwriting changing partway, through each set as the pen passed from one set of hands to the other. She thought about the years her mother had spent noticing small things and writing them down, without ever needing them to mean anything beyond what they were, an honest record of a place she loved. She opened her current volume to a fresh page. She wrote the date, the dive conditions, the canopy measurements of the outfall section, closer now to what they'd been before any of this started. Then she added a line she didn't usually include, the kind of thing her mother might have written without quite knowing why it mattered yet. Beds coming back. Slow water again at the outfall. Maybe that's the whole lesson. Not how much, but how fast. She closed the journal and set on the shelf beside her mother's, where the two records sat together the way they always had, one continuing where the other left off, the same patient attention carried forward across 50 years and counting, waiting quietly on the shelf, the way it always had, for whatever question might come next, whenever that question finally arrived.